Damn it! Don't you just hate it when this happens? Let's just turn on the light. Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you how you can create really cool particle effects in Adobe After Effects. I usually add particles in one form or another to pretty much all of my visual effects. Particles are awesome for creating effects such as sparks or energy balls or rocket trails. Whoa! Great. Well, or things like smoke and fire. This is going to be a low intermediate tutorial, and I will assume that you're at least familiar with the very basics of Adobe After Effects, like working with layers and using keyframes, but enough of me talking. Let's jump right into the tutorial. Here I have a brand new empty composition. Let's start creating some particles. Start by creating a new solid layer. I'm going to call mine particles and then hit OK. Then go over into your Effects and Presets panel and search for particle. Note that this list may vary depending on which version of After Effects you're using. One effect that is shipped with the default installation of After Effects since I believe version CS3 is the CC Particle World effect that we will be using for this tutorial. Go and apply the CC Particle World effect to the particles layer. Out of the box, the CC Particle World effect will spawn simple line-shaped particles in the center of the screen. There are a few other elements on the screen like this axis box, a horizon indicator, and this grid that represents the floor. These are just some visual helpers and they won't actually be rendered in your final effect. In the effect settings for the CC Particle World effect, under Grid and Guides, you can actually turn on and off all of these helpers. Now that we have a very simple particle effect set up, let's go through all of the options and all of the settings that you have available in the CC Particle World effect. First and most importantly, you have the birth rate. This property controls how many particles are being spawned every single frame, and as you jack this up, you'll see that there are tons more particles being spawned and our effect looks a lot more solid. If you scrub through this, you can see there's a whole bunch more particles now being emitted from the center of the screen. Let's quickly bring this back down to maybe 5. Next, you have the longevity or the lifetime of the particles. By adjusting the longevity, you can define how long your particles exist before they vanish. For example, if we lower it, you'll have the particles vanish before they fall off the screen. At least to me, the way the longevity property works is unfortunately the largest shortcoming of the CC Particle World effect. What I'm really missing is some way to randomize the longevity of my particles so that some live a little bit longer than others, and it'll just make the overall particle effect look a lot more natural and organic. But as you'll see, there's still tons of cool stuff that you can do with this effect, as I'll show you in a minute. Next, let's look at the Producer tab. In this tab, you can define the position as well as the size of the producer, which is the emitter from which all of the particles will be spawned. Here, for example, I've simply extended my emitter along the x-axis. Let's quickly undo all of those changes and let's look at the Physics tab. Within the Physics tab, you will find all of the properties that define how the particles will move. First and foremost, you will have an animation. The animation property controls both the way the particles are spawned and the way they move. Right now, this property is set to explosive. If we, for example, chose a direction axis as the animation, you will suddenly have all the particles being emitted along a direction axis. Another cool option is the cone axis, which will simply spew up the particles like a water fountain. There are lots of very different animation presets here that you can use, for example twirl, which will make your particles actually spin, or one that I really like is twirly. Well, it kind of looks a bit messy from the side, but here's another cool thing about the CC Particle World effect. The particles in the CC Particle World effect are fully 3D. That means that you can add a camera into your composition and move it around to view the clouds of particles from different angles. There's 2 ways to do this. First off, under the extras in the CC Particle World effect, you will find an effect camera. These properties are only used as long as you don't actually have a camera added into your composition. You can change, for example, the rotation, and you will see the camera rotate around our cloud of particles. So for example, the twirly one, while it looks really messy from the side, actually looks really cool top down. It looks a bit like a cyclone. Rather than using the effect camera to control how you're viewing your particles, the more likely scenario is that you will actually have a camera in your composition. So let's simply create a simple camera. I'm just going to call mine camera and hit OK. You'll notice that suddenly my particles are reset to the default view because now the way I'm viewing my particles is defined by this camera that I've added rather than by the effect camera properties in the CC Particle World effect. The way you can now view the particles from different angles is simply to switch over to the camera tool by pressing C on your keyboard and then moving around your particles, zooming in and out and positioning your camera exactly where you want it to. Let's return to our CC Particle World effect and let's change the animation back to explosive. You can increase the velocity property to have the particles shoot out of the producer a little bit more forcefully. If they're shooting a little bit too far for you, you've also got the resistance property, which will then pull them back in. One thing that I really enjoy doing is to jack up the velocity, but then increase the resistance so it looks like the particles are shooting really forcefully out of the producer, but are then being slowed down by friction. Next, you can also change the gravity and change the speed at which the particles are falling. One thing I also like to do quite a bit is actually invert the gravity so the particles seem to be floating upwards after they're being spawned. There's also two additional properties called extra and extra angle, but what they control depends a little bit of the animation that you've selected, so just play around with them, have some fun and figure out how this works. Before we move on to changing the look of our particles, let's do one last thing. Let's increase the gravity again so the particles fall downwards, and let's play a little bit with some of the physics. Under the physics tab you have a floor tab. In this tab you have all of the properties that define how the particles will react when they hit this floor plane. Right now the floor action is set to none, which means the particles simply pass through the floor. But watch what happens when we change the floor action to ice. Now the particles hitting the floor will start to slide along its surface. Let's increase the longevity a little bit just so it's a little bit more visible. Rewind to the beginning of the composition and let's play this back. That's quite a cool effect. Next, let's change the floor action to bounce. Whoa, that looks rather messy. Now, what has actually happened is that because we've set the floor action to bounce, the resistance property has been disabled. That means that now our particles are moving way too fast and being shot all over the place. Let's lower the velocity again so all of the particles still stay within the area of the screen, and let's also lower the gravity to maybe 0.5 so the particles are nicely falling onto the floor. Now if we scrub back to the beginning of our composition and play this back, you can see what the bounce action does for the floor. Particles are now hitting the floor and they're bouncing off really nicely. You can tweak the behavior of this bounce interaction to your liking by changing the bounciness, the randomness and the bounce speed. Now that we have spent so much time defining how the particles move and how the physics work, let's finally get to the fun part and define how the particles actually look. In the CC Particle World effect, under the Particle tab, you'll find all of the options to change the look and feel of your particles. The first and most important property is the particle type, which right now is set to line. If you change the particle type from line to star, suddenly all of the particles will be stars. They'll still behave exactly the same way, it's just their appearance has changed. Other cool options is, for example, the shaded sphere. Or maybe you'd want them to look like bubbles instead. Or if you're more looking for 3D elements, let's change this to cubes. This actually looks pretty cool. Let me quickly move the camera around a little bit just so we can see the cubes a little bit better. Once you've picked your particle type, there's all sorts of other properties that you can tweak. For example, you can change how fast the particles rotate. You can change the size of the particle at the moment they're being spawned and at the size of their death. So for example, if you make the birth size rather small, the cubes will be spawned as small cubes, but they'll get bigger and bigger as they live through their life. Size variation simply determines how random the size of the cubes will be, so you may have them all in exactly the same size, or you may have a lot of randomness. I prefer always having a little bit of randomness, like around 50% or even a bit more, just because I find it makes my particle effects look a little bit more organic. The next important one is probably the opacity map. In here you will see a little curve that defines the opacity of the particle over its lifespan. With the selection tool selected, you can actually draw in this curve to define how the opacity of the particles behaves over their life cycle. So right now I'm going to have my cubes fade in really quickly but then fade out softly towards the end. And you can see how gently all of the cubes disappear towards the end. Just like the opacity, you can also control the color of the particle over its lifespan. Right now the color map is set from birth to death, and you set the birth color and the death color to define. For example, if you wanted to have them start out blue, we could change the birth color to be nice and blue. So now they're being spawned blue and they die when they're red. One option that I'll prefer to use under color map, I'd like to set this to custom, which then enables the custom color map tab. And under here I actually get 5 colors to transition the particles to over the course of their life. Next, you may notice a volume shade property, and as you increase this property, some of the particles seem to get darker and some of them seem to get brighter, and it just seems to be a little bit random. However, there's a reason to this madness, and if you open up the Extras tab and then expand the Light Direction tab, you will find a single light position defined that you can move around. This is the light used to illuminate the particles, and the volume shade property controls how strongly this light affects the particles. Let's move the camera around a little bit so maybe it's a little bit easier to see. There, can you see how me changing the position of the light changes the way and the direction from which the light is hitting all of the particles? It's pretty cool, although quite honestly I haven't actually used this property all that much. A property that I like to use much more is the transfer mode, which is currently set to composite. This defines how all of the overlapping particles are being blended together. For example, if we change this to screen, suddenly all of the cubes are a little bit transparent and they kind of blended together a little bit nice and it becomes a little bit glowy. You can intensify that by changing it to add, which adds even more heat to the particle cloud. I actually really like this effect, and this is going to form the basis for the fire effect that we're going to create next. Here I have a very simple clip of me pretending to spawn an energy ball. I have already added a null object into the scene that is motion tracked to follow the palm of my hand. If you don't know how to do that yourself, I have a separate motion tracking tutorial that you can check out, and I'm going to put a link to that tutorial in the description of this video. In this part of the tutorial, I'd much rather just focus on creating some fire in my hand with the CC Particle World effect. In order to add particles into the scene, we first need to create a new solid layer, and I'm going to call mine Fire. Next, apply the CC Particle Worlds effect to this layer, and let's position the producer to be right on top of my hand. Rather than changing the XYZ position of the producer in this tab, you can actually click on the little producer icon and drag it around your scene to position it where you need. So let's place it right on top of my hand. Next, let's open up the physics tab and let's change the animation to fire. Cool, that's probably not too far off from what we want. I think the particles are being pulled up a little bit too quickly, so let's reduce the gravity a little bit, so the particles float up a little bit slower. Notice how the particles are still shooting out of the producer at quite a bit of force. For that, let's reduce the velocity down to 0. Next, let's change the look of our particle. One of the cool things you can actually do with the CC Particle World effect is you can apply a texture to the particles. Here I have a very small image called a glow sphere. Let's drag this into our composition, and if we check this out, all it is a little circle with a little bit of a glow around it. For this effect, this is how I want my individual fire particles to look. Because we don't actually need to see this layer, we can disable the visibility and drag it to the bottom of the composition. Let's return to our fire, go back and select the CC Particle World effect, expand the Particle tab and change the particle type to Textured Faded Disk. Uh-oh, all of our particles just vanished. Well, that's just because we haven't assigned a texture yet. And in the Particle tab, under Texture, you will find a Texture Layer property. Change this Texture Layer property to our glow sphere. Cool, that's actually looking pretty good. I think I'm going to jack up the birth rate to maybe around 5 though, just to add a few more particles into the mix. Cool, that's actually starting to look quite good. However, I'm noticing that all of the particles are being spawned in quite large an area and they kind of seem to be spinning a little bit. This is actually being controlled by the extra property when you have your animation set to fire. So let's reduce the extra property to maybe almost 0, so the fire is coming just from the palm of my hand. Nice, that looks much better. The particles flow a lot more like I'd expect a fire to behave. Let's go back to the particle settings and let's decrease the depth size, because if you're watching a real fire, sparks usually start out fairly big but then they get smaller as they float up into the air. Size variation around 50% is probably alright. Maybe I'll jack it up just a little bit to around 60. Don't think it makes too much of a difference. And now let's change the transfer mode from composite to screen. Wow, much better. See how the glow suddenly gets added to the fire? If you do want to go one step further, and to me this is more a matter of taste, you can also change it to add, which adds even more heat into this particle effect. Let's scroll back a little bit and play this back. Sweet, it's starting to look a lot more like fire. There's just 2 more things I'd like to tweak. First, open up the opacity map and draw a little bit more of a softer fade out into the particles. This just ensures that the particles, once they turn red, fade out a little bit softer and then don't just suddenly disappear. Next, this fire has far too much yellow and very little red at the tail end to me, so let's change the color map over to custom. Let's open up the custom color map and this is actually not too bad. Maybe I'll darken the color at 25 and 50% a little bit, so I want the brightness to be confined to a fairly small area. Again, this is kind of up to your own taste and you can really play with the colors and create really crazy effects. Next, one of the big limitations that people have with particle effects is that they use a particle effect and then nothing else. But particles, it's just a layer. I can add other effects on top of this particle effect now to reshape and to change how all of this looks. One of the big things I'd like to add for my fire effects is actually a directional blur. So make sure your fire layer is selected and search for the directional blur effect. Apply the effect to the fire layer, make sure your direction is totally vertical, and then increase the blur length to start streaking out the fire upwards. Obviously you can totally overdo this, but maybe let's go with around 10% or so, just so that the fire is more elongated rather than just being round little bubbles. Scroll back a little bit, play this back. Yep, it's starting to look a lot more like fire. Next, one of my probably most used effects, strangely enough, is the CC vector blur effect, because it makes everything look a little bit more organic and a little bit more interesting. So go over into your Effects and Presets panel and search for the CC vector blur effect. Apply this effect to your layer, and as you play around with the amount property, you'll notice that it'll distort the fire into all sorts of weird and fantastical shapes. It's quite easy to overdo this. I really just want to add a tiny bit of vector blur to make the fire flames look a little bit more like strands rather than like bubbles. Maybe we'll go with around 10%. Let's check out how this looks. I think it's a little bit too much actually. Let's reduce the vector blur amount to maybe around 5. I think that looks much better. And this kind of, this could kind of pass for fire. I'm gonna add a few other things to it. One of the things that we are going to still add is a glow effect. Search for and apply the glow effect to the fire layer. Let's increase the glow threshold to maybe around 90, maybe even a little bit more. I really just want the yellow, the hot part of the flame, to glow. Jack up the glow radius to give your fire a nice healthy glow and, adjust the glow intensity to taste. I'm going to jack it up a little bit because I want the fire to glow a little bit stronger. Let's rewind this a little bit and play this back. Cool, I think that looks pretty awesome for a simple particle effect. Finally, let's zoom back out and let's finish off the effect by, first off, having the fire spawn at the right moment, so just when I'm lowering my hand to spawn the fire, and then also have the fire follow the movement of my hand. First off, we want the fire to spawn right here, right when I'm spawning it in my hand. So let's just shove this layer over a little bit so that this is where the fire will start to spawn in my hand, which is kind of cool. That's kind of timing-wise pretty good, I'd say. Next, we want this layer to follow the movement of the null object, which is already attached to my hand. One of the big problems that people have is they now have particles and they have a null object or some layer that they want to attach these particles to. And so they select the layer. So for example, select the fire layer, select the parenting tool and attach it to the null object. Done, right? Well, let's play this back and have a look. Well, that kind of just looked awful. Yes, first off, the fire isn't quite right on the positioning, but also have a look at the particles. They all stay totally upright. It just doesn't feel like you're moving the particles. It feels like you're literally just moving the layer, which is exactly what is happening. So let's undo that and forget that we ever tried that, because that's not the way you attach particles to a null object. Instead, we will have to use expressions. And yes, expressions are very scary. I do have a separate tutorial on expressions if you're just getting started. Again, the link to the expressions tutorial will be in the description of this video. In order to do this magic, first select the hand null object and reveal the position property by pressing P on your keyboard. Then select the fire layer and in the CC particle world effect, under the producer tab, alt-click onto the stopwatch icon next to the position X property. This will open up our favorite expression editor, and what we're going to do in here, we're going to type open bracket, then take the pick whip icon and scroll down and select the X position of the hand null object, and then continue the expression with minus width /2, which is divides by 2, close the round bracket, and then /width, which again divides the whole thing by the width of your composition. Click outside of the expression editor, and now if we scrub through, you will actually see that the producer, the actual emitter, at least on the X position, is following along with the position of the null object. Finally, we also need to attach the Y position of the producer to the position of the null object, and we're going to do that exactly the same way. In the CC particle world effect, under the Producer tab, Alt-click onto the Position Y property. In the expression editor, type open bracket, then select the pick whip icon and this time select the Y position of the null object. And then continue the expression with minus height /2, close bracket, /width. Click outside of the expression editor to apply it. And now if we play back our composition, doesn't that look much better? It looks much more natural because the particles are being spawned from the position of the null object rather than just having the flat layer follow the movement of my hand. Now, I know this isn't perfect and there's quite a lot of things that I probably continue tweaking to really make this look a little bit better and sit a little bit better in the scene, but I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to how easy it is to create really cool particle effects directly in Adobe After Effects. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, if you have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. If you want to see more cool visual effects and filmmaking tutorials, make sure you subscribe to my channel by clicking on the subscribe button up there in the top left hand corner. I'd also greatly appreciate it if you gave the video a thumbs up, favorite it and share it with the world. And if you want to get in contact, you can also find and follow me on Facebook, Twitter or Google+. Until next time, I will see you later.